Welcome everybody. Today we are doing a review of the World Coffee Roasting Championships 2024, the top 10 competitors, looking at sample roasts, their approaches to sample roasting with the Link Coffee Roaster, and just doing a bit of a deep dive into everything that they did. Joining me today is Sam Cora from Nucleus Coffee Tools. We have Jerome Rosler, also from Nucleus Coffee Tools, and Sean Ellis from Kaffelogic. And I'm Jordan Montgomery, also from Nucleus Coffee Tools. Cool. So I guess today we'll start with a bit of a discussion about the competition, maybe for some people who aren't aware what the Coffee Roasting Championship is. This year it was held in Copenhagen in Denmark and involves 3 different days of roasting with a sample roaster, roasting with a large batch roaster, going through grading coffee, screening coffee, planning out roasts, cupping coffees, and it ends up with a top 4 in the world at the end of it. So Sam and Sean, you were both in Copenhagen as well. What did you observe about the competition this year and how it ran? Because as far as I'm aware, you've both been at other competitions as well.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jordan. I think the competition for me this year was exciting to see. Obviously, this partnership for the next 3 years with World of Coffee and having Kaffelogic and Nucleus present the Link as the official sample roaster is a big stepping stone for us into learning how the machine will be used for the competition parameters. What aspects can we improve in future competitions to make sure that the competitors get the best experience and ability to achieve the roast profiles they want. But overall, the experience, I think, was really positive. The competitors were all fantastic, very accommodating to allowing us to get used to the competition format with the machine and how we get around, certain obstacles and challenges or difficulties that make, Link and the project a little bit different to maybe a standard roast that they would have used. But I think, competitive feedback, seeing them interact with it, seeing them use it, it was just overall, 1, very exciting, but 2 was really great to be able to rub shoulders with some of the best, roast minds in the industry. How did you feel, Sean?
Yeah, I thought it all went really, really well. It was our first time being in a roasting competition, so it was a great first impression. Seeing how a lot of the competitors were using the different profiles and the different features were quite eye-opening. To be able to see what they did and how they interacted with it, some of them for the first time. All in all, I think it was a great experience, and I think we're just looking forward to seeing what we can do better next year, just to make it easier for everyone.
Awesome. And Jerome, you weren't at the competition this year, but you've had some experience with the roasting competitions and before, and you're also quite heavily involved in other competitions such as the Brewers Cup, barista competitions, helping competitors. What do you think that the competitors may have experienced if they were using the Link for the first time at the competition? Someone who's experienced in roasting and has come in using it for the first time. What is it like for an experienced competitor, experienced roaster rather?
Of course, what I found really cool overlooking of the data was how each person kind of manipulated their own variables, which they really want to isolate to allow them to score highly, but as well to get a good interpretation of what the coffee would be and how they can utilize this data to correlate it over to the production roaster. Because a lot of them use the Link to be able to understand the key ideas of the coffee through various batch sizes, various fan adjustments, and different developments, so that they could see how far or how little they can push each individual coffee, which I found to be really unique, because at the end they have to create a blend, which is the most important thing of all, to be able to score really highly within the competition.
Awesome. Well, I guess that's a perfect segue into looking at some of the competitors' roasts. So what we had planned today was to go through the top 4 competitors. So each year in the competition, the top 4 are the finalists, and they are awarded 1st through 4th place. Maybe we can start with you, Jerome, looking at 4th place, which was China. So that was Chenglei Diao. Forgive me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. So I believe that's the one on station 3 there. So for anyone looking at this is the data sheet we've collected from all the roasts. So on the far left column, you'll see under the competitor in station 4, under the black cell there, you'll see a log, and that's all the different roasts that people did on the individual roasters. So we're looking now at the what is it, third one down, as we can see in the view just now. So
Yeah.
that's, yep, competitor Chenglei Diao on station 2. So maybe if we can zoom in slightly further on that. Right. Cool. So Jerome, what I can see from this one is that Chenglei has done 4 different roasts throughout his competition preparation with the link sample roaster. He's done 3 different, he's done all his 4 roasts with the cupping roast style as a base, but he's actually done one custom profile as well.
Of course. Yeah, so if we bring up the actual curve that he used for the first custom one, it'd be like a really good insight, because based off of this initial roast that he did, I could see that he was really trying to do something that he was very familiar with. I imagine that he hasn't had much access to the link, but wanted to emulate the kind of style and approach that he would use with the Ikawa, as an example. So what he did is a very strong rate of rise incline, and kind of tapered it off toward the end with the mayors and development. I think this gave him the initial instinct of how he can utilize this roaster, how the coffee would actually taste. From there, he really wanted to trust the system. It seemed like he was really confident about it, and he decided to go with 50-gram batch sizes. I feel like he chose to use 50-gram batch sizes so he could try multiple different aspects and be able to compare it side by side in the quickest amount of time, because as we know, it takes a lot faster for 50 grams to cool down than it does 100 grams. And so you can see from what you're showing now, Jordan, that he did a very strong increase in the first 2 minutes. This very much emulates kind of an Ikawa style roast, and having like this shorter style of the Maillards and development. He basically wanted to keep his development the same for this one, which he wanted to do around that 12%, which ended up being 50 seconds. And then he wanted to compare it directly to what we have for our suggested profiles, which is that classic cupping profile, the D12, which is at 12%, and a 208 profile. He decided to go and trust the solutions, which allowed him to adjust the fan to 0.025. He probably inspected the beans and probably saw that they're a little bit bigger. So he wanted to have more oscillation within the roast. Within that, he did 12% development, and I'm sure that he understood where his baseline was. Now from there, you can see his follow-up decisions were like, okay, let me start to test this coffee out a little bit more. So he tried to do one that was a little bit slightly less developed and control it, which was the first initial one, and then take it step by step from there. So for the next roast, you can see that he adjusted it to 13.5%. I think the 13.5%, and then he adjusted it to 0.03 on the fan adjustment. This will allow him to see a little bit more of a developed expression of the coffee. Maybe he wants to see how much body he can get out of it, or if he was lacking a particular style of sweetness. And then from this next step forward, he tried the exact same profile and decided to develop it all the way up to 16%. He did decide to drop down the fan adjustment to that second initial approach that he did. He probably found this to be the best in terms of visual oscillation of what he anticipated. And then the 16%, I imagine he just wanted to see how far he could take the coffee without getting that too much of a roasty expression. All this data would have helped him strongly when it came to see how far that he could push this coffee when he wanted to do it on the stronghold. Something that was really cool that I picked up as well is that competitor one who came first place and him had like the same style of approach where they decided to go with 50-gram batch sizes and really utilize like the fan adjustment and development. I think this leads a roaster to be able to make really smart and sound decisions when they are doing it on the production side. Even when it comes to the day-to-day roaster, you always want to see how far you can push the coffee and what expression that really suits the specific style, which would be cupping. So he probably found something that was in that middle ground, which allowed him to make a really smart decision when it came to the actual competition.
I guess the follow-on question I had from that, and thank you for such a thorough breakdown. My next question was for someone like Chenglei who has used the same batch size, a relatively similar or same, a profile pack for his roasting, all but one of his roasts with the same power curve, but then he has those variances in fan speed and in development. How do you think that would help when translating it to his roast plan? Because that is the component from the sample roasting component of the competition, enables you to make a roast plan, which is actually what gets scored.
Of course, for that, I think he would use a lot of the fan adjusts to articulate how he was going to use airflow. You can see probably with his style of roasting that he really wanted to utilize airflow in the beginning part of his roast when he was doing it with strongholds, and figure out what kind of development percentage would really suit with that style of coffee, and try and mimic the expression he has getting off the link and do it onto the stronghold, so that he can do like some side by sides and really pinpoint exactly what he wants his blend to taste, but as well as the singles. So I feel like it gives you so much data and so much intel to make a really sound decision on the style that he does personally want to roast. Because if you see from that, as you said, the fan adjust, he was one of the ones using the most fan airflow basically in the beginning part of his roast, that allowed him to really get that kind of airiness and expression that he really wanted to push. And most likely it gave him a lot more evenness, and he was able to really push that on the stronghold to really make that balance of the acid and sweetness in particular.
Yeah, if I can jump in on that point, I think that's a really interesting aspect I also noticed about this competitor, of keeping a variable the same. So he didn't change the profile plan base or the power curve, but actually manipulating elements of DTR, adjust, and the fan speed as these variables, which I think in the competition time frame and the amount of time that he has shows that he had a clear goal of what he wanted to test out and see, and actually keep things that he would understand the same, so that when he tasted the differences in maybe how they express, he could pinpoint them down to certain aspects to assist with that plan on the production component of the competition, which I think is a really smart use of the, I guess, sample time, to not have too many variables to consider and actually know what variables you change and how that may affect the cup profile.
I guess it's a perfect transition to our next competitor, which is Andrea from Austria, who placed third. So he has a lot of similarities to the Chinese competitor, in that he has the same roast style base, so cupping for all his profiles. All but one of his roasts were done with the same profile pack, so that's the D12. And he's had a few variations in his power curves, one variation load size, and then a few variations in DTR as well. So I guess maybe Sean, maybe you can jump in first and see just exactly what you observed from, I guess, all the 5 different roasts from this competitor, and how you think he may have, utilized these variances to his advantage in the competition.
Yeah, I think from what it looks like he went with the standard recommendation, which I think is a fantastic starting point, just to kind of see where things might be at the standard recommendation, and then from there experimenting with maybe changing up Maillard a little bit more, a little bit less in the 207 and 208.5s, as well as adding in a bit of extra variance by switching to the 10% profile pack, just to try and get quite a different expression, in case maybe he wanted to just kind of cover as much range as he could. With this, also testing out what the coffee might do at different first crack times, different end temperatures, and just really, I think, covering a lot of his bases around development and Maillard. Yeah, I think that's a pretty crucial thing, to try and understand the full range of the coffee and what it might do in different situations. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, Sam, you and I were discussing this competitor the other day, and you were saying, I guess, overall, he probably has, the most aesthetically pleasing profiles, just the way in which he kind of logged everything.
Yeah, look, he's someone I want to dive into and analyze some of the profiles and pull up, and just go through some of how he thought and how he used the system. From a competitor point, when I was going through his logs and looking at everything, not just the data sheets, it really shows that he's used all aspects of, the Link and Link Studio in terms of the functionality. Also some of his decision making, which I think is really interesting. But when it comes to, I guess, a picture perfect expression of how you would use a link, he seems to be, for me, a competitor who is really showing some amazing use of the link. And let me just pull up the profiles if you bear with me for 2 seconds. So I want to start with his first profile, which is the log 16. Aesthetically, what we see from this profile is a really beautiful use of how we want to see the profiling system happen. We can see right in this point, if we, have a look at the first crack, this is the DTR, I guess, position, which was expected. We can see it's within the 5 seconds, which is right in that sweet spot of where we want first crack to occur on the system. I think a really interesting aspect, he's probably one of the only competitors that logged the phases. So we see every aspect of how much time we spent in that dry phase, the Maillard phase, development phase, and percentage of the actual roast plan base that he used was very nice. And then just seeing some of the, manipulation that he did. So this is essentially a D profile, which would have a 12% setup. He's playing around with DTR as his base setting to get the right expression for the different coffees. It's my understanding that they're provided with various coffees that they can use in the blend, from washed, wet hulled, natural as a base, and seeing him range through the different profiles that he has, I guess, options to look at. All of his profiles, and I'm going to move here to profile 17 log. We can see just the thought process in the planning, the details of how he's manipulated each different one, and just the style of roast that he's achieved. I think the reason why his roast is so nice, and one thing that I mentioned to the competitors in the background, is really consider your batch size. The main thing that, as a roaster, which I was for many years, not so much, production roasting these days, but I always had a strong belief that 2/3 of the capacity of a roaster really gives you the best control over balancing out the heating aspect, that you have enough self-generated heat from bean to bean touching, but also making sure that there's enough room that self-generated heat is not going to take over the roast. And we can see that because he's opted for those 80-gram batch sizes for majority of his roast, that he's able to really have a very smooth transition. ROR desired looks really nice throughout the roast profiles. He's never hit a crash point or a flick point or anything that would, activate other features of the link to kick in, providing just a really stable roast from, start to finish, and so meticulously done throughout all these profiles. I'm going to quickly jump across to 17 and go through them all. But as you see, all of them, when it comes to pitch point and where we're expecting first crack, he's just right on the money with how he's done his density assessment. I think this guy is really understands the link system, understands how to get the best out of it, and seems to have used all these features that he has available to him to his benefit. I think it's very interesting at the end of the roast, his last two profiles are essentially working on the same coffee. I would assume that he's changed to a different log, or a different coffee style here, and he's trying to figure it out. The interesting factor that I noticed in this one is where he chose to go with the profile going down in batch size to maybe achieve a smoother roast. But one thing he didn't consider, and I'm going to go back to, I'll just pull up the last log for us to visualize here, is you can see in this log that this is probably the only log that we see the first crack outside of the window with where we'd expect it, and the biggest gap from the default. I'm going to go back to the data sheet here, and I think this is a nice one to explain on why that may have occurred. So if we look at the data sheet on this particular roast for this competitor, we can see that he's changed his batch size down into 55 grams away from 80, but he's kept the same power curve. And one thing that I mentioned is I really like this decision-making here with 80 grams. I think it's a great starting point to make sure you have control over the roast. There's enough batch size and amount in there to give you that full weighted, sweet, juicy expression. But when he opted to go for a smaller batch size, keeping the same power curve, and generally how the link system works is we have a feature in there called advanced roast details in the app, which when you change batch size, it would generally compensate in the power curve recommendation. And I think why we saw that slightly delayed first crack that we can see it's 10 seconds later than this profile is that we didn't factor in the change of batch size into how that may have occurred. And possibly when he took this recommendation, he decided to change load size, but didn't re-enter the information into the app, which would have assisted him in maybe recommending 209.5 and achieving maybe a more aesthetically pleasing roast from the system perspective. That said, without trying the roast, this one down the bottom could have been right on the money in terms of the timing, spending a little bit longer in the Maillard phase and same amount of development. Possibly that approach worked great, but you definitely do see that relating in probably the highest increase after the point of first crack for that particular roast and longest roast time. So would have been very interesting to be able to taste all of these and match them to the theory. But as I said, for me, I get excited to see someone using all of the features that was available to them to the fullest. And I really think that this competitor in the time frame that he had just did such a magnificent job of really creating quite a detailed and thorough approach to how he did his sample roasting.
Yeah, I think 4 near perfect roasts out of 5 is pretty good, especially under the pressure in a competition environment. So yeah, were a slight change made into the advanced roast details, then we would have been looking at a straight flush of amazing profiles.
Yeah.
I just have one last question on Andrea from Austria before we move on to Poland, because I'm very excited to talk about Poland. You mentioned he was one of the only competitors, if not the only one, that used all the features, including logging color change. What advantage would that have given him in the competition, if any?
Yeah, I think that why that's super interesting, and I'll go back to the view that allows us to see the profiles, is by logging the color change and aspects of the coffee. It just gives him a really detailed expression that when he translates it to the production of, what and how and where he should apply his heat when he transitions to the stronghold to maybe get the best expression out of this coffee. I think that the nice aspect is he sees the percentage in drying, Maillard, and development, and potentially if he understands the other system more and maybe the tendencies, he can adjust or assist in that coffee, because essentially the link system and all Kaffelogic manufactured equipment is pretty unique in the fact that it doesn't have a preheat. We start at ambient temperature and then put the preheating phase in the roast cycle, which means sometimes people find it's not a direct translation that you can take the exact heating points and time frames of a roast and directly translate it. By logging all of the aspects of the phase timings, I think for him, when it came to creating a roast plan to use in the production component of the competition, he would have a lot more data and information on timings or percentages that he thought expressed the coffee best, giving him potentially a slight advantage when it came to his roast plan theory aspect to score, really good points in that particular aspect. And as Jerome said, there's a lot of points in roast planning. The more data, the more details that you have. For some people, it works in their advantage.
Awesome. I guess with that, we might jump to look to our next competitor, and maybe Sean, you can lead us on this. So in many ways, Mateusz, apologies again if I'm mispronouncing it, from Poland is, in many ways kind of opposite to Andrea from Austria that we just looked at. So rather than using all the different features of the link and I guess manipulating roasts and experimenting, he kind of, I guess, placed a lot of trust in the link and kind of just went with the flow of what the link is recommending. So if you could maybe highlight those cells, Sam, so that's rows 11 to 14. Yeah. Awesome. So only 2 roasts, both of them with 100-gram batch size, fan adjustments on both, and almost similar data on every single element, including first crack time. So Sean, taking a look at this, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think this is a fantastic example of essentially one of the most purest ways to use link, and that is just taking the coffee that you have, getting the recommendation, really trusting the system, and then just using it to get your sample. I think it doesn't get any purer than that. It is interesting to see, only 2 roasts come through, and very similar points and similar data points. But I think, you know, if you're going for just a kind of like a plain view of what the coffee is going to do, what it might taste like, I think that it definitely gives you enough of a starting point to understand what might happen. But yeah, very, very, very interesting. And yeah, great to see, you know, so much trust put into the system. Slight variances on the increase post first crack, slightly more developed, slightly less developed. Gives you a little bit of a range to see what the coffee might be doing, any kind of inconsistencies in the green. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
also noticed that Matthews was the only competitor from the top 10, as far as I can see, that didn't manually log his first crack. So as we saw in the profile that just came up before, we didn't have that zone, the first crack zone. We didn't have that little green triangle that indicates where he's logged first crack. So he has let the system just run completely automatically to an extent and let it just kind of do its thing, which in a competition environment, yeah, it indicates a lot of trust. So either, you know, he just wanted to do his roast and get out of there. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's funny if I can step in on this competitor. I remember doing the debrief and a debrief with him at the start, and he was running late. He's missed the flight, so he rocked in and we did a custom session one-on-one, and he was just very relaxed, very confident, understood the system, how he wanted to use it, went through it. Like, you know, I offered him 45 minutes of time to go through it. He was like, look, I know what I'm going to do, know my approach. You know, 10 minutes in, he was like, thank you very much. I'm not going to take any more of your time. And just, you know, obviously very confident that he was going to use this segment of the competition to get a quick understanding of like maybe the coffees themselves. But when it came to, you know, playing around too much with the aspects of the coffee, DTR adjustments, aside from the fan adjust increasing it slightly up, going with what we would call almost the default profile. And it's not just a default base of what the app has recommended, is actually the default profile that comes up as the base that we build the packs on and profiles, which it makes sense whether it's strategic or not. The default profile is considered the best starting point for any coffee without needing to really manipulate it away too much. Which would be the default for all profiles in the cupping space is the D12% 208 profile. And we can see that if we actually go into the data, it actually says it here, profile short name, Nucleus default. It's unedited from those points. You know, there's no logging of first crack, which would deviate a different termination point from the intended time. And what he's chosen to do here is just really rely on the predictive system of the roast and just let it track through the system unedited. When it comes to some of the other features of this profile, we see that there's no boost zones. These are zones that are coded into the other profile packs of the ADIS system, which allows, after the point of first crack, a little control period to level out the coffee. This one, essentially being the base, is the most raw and I guess feature heavy profile approach that you can have. And possibly that by just going without all of those features turned on, he just had a very honest and transparent expression of the true characteristics of the coffee that then he could adapt into a really smart roast plan. But I'm not sure that the theory and the idea behind it, but I love the ballsy approach of 2 roasts done, default profile for both, and get out of there. So I think that is it's a really interesting one when you pull up the data and get to assess and compare how the approaches have been made. Do you have anything, Jerome, that you think interesting about this approach, knowing the extensity of the link features you can use and why he may have chose this particular approach?
Yeah, it just shows that like it's a complete trust in the system. I find it unique because there's multiple coffees that obviously that you need to play with, and he just chose to either look at 1 or 2 coffees from it and just had other complete decision making from there. I don't know how specifically it could translate directly over to like the stronghold, because he didn't make any changes to see how far he could kind of push the coffee or how under to find that like fine threshold. If I were to like go again and if I was that competitor, I'd probably maybe didn't have enough time or something, but maybe go on a lower batch size to be able to get a roast happening a little bit faster, because he did decide to use 100 grams, which obviously does take a little bit longer to cool in comparison to these other people that we're looking at, which use anywhere from 50 to 80. But I'd love to see like a little bit more subtle changes so you can get better data to take over to the production style roaster. But I found that, like you said, Sam, was very ballsy, but I think he came in with a plan, he executed exactly what he wanted to, but was able to take that over to the stronghold and see how he could manipulate the changes from there.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you that you definitely see the two coffees that he roasted in the characteristic behavior. And the nice thing about maybe this data information is it's less roast influence with what the roaster decided to do and how the two different coffees that he decided to roast actually behave, because essentially there's no changes. They're just running through the system as an automated profile plan. And we can just see that relating to the differences in, the time of the roast, the increase of the roast, the end temperatures of just the natural raw tendencies of the coffee. And possibly that played into his strategy of how does the coffee behave on an automated kind of approach. And then he could actually use that data of how the coffee behaved tendency wise to actually create that roast blend. So maybe we're all looking at thinking it's a simple approach, but possibly it's ingenious, the fact that by not altering anything, you get the true tendencies of the coffee that allowed him to obviously achieve such a fantastic result in the competition overall.
That's it. I mean,
Which,
second place is a fantastic result. And I mean, I know I've seen a similar approach with the Brewers Cup. I know, Sam, you came second in the world in Brewers Cup. Jerome, you're heavily involved in Brewers Cup competitions around the world. I know a lot of people who, for the compulsory component or, just testing out copies to use for their open service, they will have a baseline recipe. They'll just go to that the first time, every time, and just say, cool, where do I deviate from here? So in a way, like maybe what Mateusz has done is very strategic. He's just gone, cool, I'm just going to roast all of them in this manner. And then that I have enough experience with the link and with roasting coffees to know how I can translate this in the future. So
yeah.
I think it's super cool.
Yeah, look, agreed.
And it sounds like he was
Definitely.
confident. Yeah.
As I said, it gives you a really great expression of the raw tendencies of how a coffee will behave under the same setting, which gives you a really good insight on the attributes that you may need to control and manage when you're putting it on a production cycle in terms of, first crack times, heat applications, fan speeds. It's, maybe because the sample component is really their first look at the coffees they've been provided. Possibly, as I said, his strategy was like, I just want to use this component of the competition to understand the tendencies, and then I'll create a plan from there, which obviously worked for him. And, congratulations on, such a, what would say, efficient simplicity, but pure genius in terms of the data that he managed to extract and how he could turn it in his favor for, a very close to being the world's best roaster in this competition for 2024.
And that with that, I guess we will move on to the official world's best roaster for 2024. So that's TaiYang Liu. So he has six different roasts, so I can see it correctly. Again, all based on a cupping roast style base. He's got a few variations with the profile pack that he's used, and almost all of his roasts vary in some way with either the DTR or the power curve that he's using. So I guess maybe Sean, if you want to start us off and just I guess a general overview of what you saw from TaiYang, and what's your opinion on what our world champion has done for sample roasting?
I think he's taken a fantastic approach of really stretching out his time and his samples, of just really covering all of his bases. I mean, we can see him here. There was one that ended quite early. Not exactly sure what happened there. But otherwise, utilizing that 50 grams, pushing in more roasts in a quicker time, quicker cooling, just really maximizing his time, not really playing with the fan too much, keeping that variable locked in, and then just messing around with development, between that 1 minute mark and 42-second mark. Yeah, it's just really looks like he's just trying to play around and see what might happen, trying different things, how we can take that over, going with you know, his with the A 10% going with maybe a slightly less aggressive to slightly more aggressive profile, how that's going to interact, and what he can expect going into production and what he might be able to pull out of it.
Mm. Looking at his profile, so he does have, as I mentioned, like a variation each time. So he's starting with the D12 profile pack in the first 2 rows. Then he moves to A10, and then he goes back to D12. But every single roast actually has a different DTR percentage. So I guess, Sam, if you could highlight maybe column J there. So that's our DTR percentage there. So for me, I would find that risky if I were a competitor. And like, you know, I'm by no means a roasting competitor, but having an adjustment on your DTR with each roast, and then changing other variables at the same time. I mean, that takes someone of quite, you know,
Yeah.
significant skill in order to interpret all the different data coming in. So
Yeah.
I guess, Sam, what do you interpret from that?
Look, I see this competitor really use this time to explore, as Sean said, all the bases and possibilities. You can see at the start of the roast, like varied roast plans, which I'm sure the coffees provided all had different densities and different processes, which would give him different base plans to work on. It would also recommend different starting power curves. If I'm to comment on what I think happened here when I assessed that log, is it looks like he's manually terminated a log. Possibly it wasn't tracking through the roast as he wished, or he wanted to change a particular variable. One thing which I'd mention is it's likely that he wasn't quite aware of that he could adjust his DTR live, and you can see him opting for an adjusted away from the default to 15% on this particular one. But that, or he's accidentally clicked end during the first roast. Either way, he was one of the competitors that got through the most roasts. So possibly he did a throwaway instead of letting it track through on an approach that he didn't want, terminate that one and get a new roast in order to work through some of the plans that he did through here. I really like the use of exploration. Like, to me, using this feature is it's really great to use, obviously, the different profile plans, different power curves in terms of heat approaches assessed, and then also using DTR in order to adjust the development percent and time that we spend in the development phase. You can see that even though he played so much, he had a very consistent range of heat increase. I think that we're talking a variation within 0.8 in terms of all the approach. And I think that what is looking at, as I said, it's very important as a roaster that you have your variables and your constants. It very much appears to me that although he's playing with so many variables, there's attributes and constants in terms of increases, ranges, times in the development phase that are very consistent throughout all of the roasts. I really think it's very smart in the time frame. I think you're allotted 45 minutes to work in these smaller batch sizes from an efficiency perspective. Jerome's touched on it quite a few times that smaller batch sizes will cool under a minute 20, a minute 30 in a link system. So having that advantage that you can get so many roasts done within your time really allows you to explore so many variables. And as I said, I'll cycle through the profiles again that he has done. But when you look at them and how he's played with them, definitely really nailed like almost all of them. Very similar in terms of approach of manually logging and details, maybe not the color change and the phase timing, but when it comes to DTR percentages, how he's played around with the manipulation, like there's some really beautiful logs there. I think one aspect which I wanted...
If I can jump in as
Yeah.
well, Sam, I think it's something like really unique about him in comparison to a lot of the other competitors is I'm going to presume based off the way that he is roasting that he actually looked at 3 different coffees. Based off that, he really like trusted the system. You can see that he decided to do the two first initial ones at 207 and then the 2 second ones at 210.5 with the APAC profile, and then the last one with the variation there of 208 and 211.5. He probably decided to use and trust the system, trust the density, and it probably had the recommended fan adjust. And he decided just to control the development and see where he could take this coffee in terms of it. So you can see with the 2 that he isolated here with the A, and they're both exact same power curve. He decided to do one at 10% and one at 11%. He probably looked at it like visually and was like, cool, let me see what I can do to take this further. But then on the final 2 profiles, profiles as well, that he did one at 2:08, but you can see if you look across that his first crack time was quite late in comparison to what he was really aiming for, which was 5:43, and it was cracking at quite a late time. So what he did with the next adjustment, he probably used advanced dial-in and decided to go up using the 2:11.5 profile to get that exact same profile that he actually wanted in the first place, but to actually really see it and controlling the development so that they're both exactly the same. I find that he did like the ideal utilization and seeing like all the coffees, different representations, and having that controlled variable, as you were saying before, Sam, of the load size and the profiles.
Yeah. I think one thing that I'm going to touch just on the profiles and have a look at it, because aesthetically, you look at some of the larger batch size roasting and it has this beautiful picturesque view. And you have a look at these roasts and it has a little bit of wobble to the start. What this is because he's utilized the bare minimum roast, it just takes a little bit of time for the thermocouple to, I guess, register the roast as effectively. So you see this, a little bit of, smaller batch size of thermocouple not registering the exact, but when he actually has, tracked on that the beans have started to expand throughout the roasting process, how nice it starts to hold onto the profile and it's able to actually register the data in that regards. And as you can see, this particular profile itself, bang on, like you cannot be more accurate to the estimated data to how you've, planned and used that roast approach from the system. So how he was manipulating and using the coffees there, to me is, working within the ranges. Always, I find it's most difficult when you work with those smaller batch sizes. The reason that is because you need to rely more on the machine as the generation of the heat source. There's not as much bean to bean contact because there's not that bigger mass size that will, I guess, convect the heat itself and convey it between bean to bean touching, that we're really relying on the fan and the heat, or what we call applied heat, throughout the roasting process to dictate this roast, which puts a lot of trust on the stability of the machine when you are roasting in such small batch sizes, knowing that it is variable from 100 to 50 grams, that you really are relying on the applied heat from the machine over the coffee, I guess, generating its heat. What they see as an advantage in that is that you're able to control the coffee. You're able to make sure it fits your plan over maybe the coffee itself dictating how it's going to move and some of the tendencies and characteristics. We can see that really evident here if we zoom into this end section, just how tight it is to the profile, because he has such a small batch size and he's using on that applied heat from the machine. We have really that increase that is very much onto the default profile, opposed to a profile that maybe has a larger batch size and some of that heat movement is self-generated, which the machine is compensating for always with how the system that Kaffelogic has built. But we can see that when we go down in smaller batch sizes, it's very much relying on the applied heat and the profile approach to how you would get that outcome. But for me, analyzing the profiles, amazing groundwork. Like, he must have been ripping through his 45 minutes like a machine to be able to get that amount of logs done, clear decision making, clear exploration. I think when it came to creating a roast plan, he would have a really in-depth understanding of all the coffees. And as Jerome said, it's not just focusing on one coffee. He's really looked at, probably all of the coffees that he's been supplied, what approaches he can get, and then from there dictated on creating a very effective roast plan on the production.
That's it. And as we've mentioned, this component of the competition with sample roasting isn't the quality of the roast you're producing from the roaster. It's the roast plan that you create afterwards that then leads to your production roasting. So exploring the different avenues of how you can roast, what adjustments you can make, getting as much data as possible, as we've said, is probably the most advantageous strategy to have. So I think that TaiYang has done a really fantastic job in just ripping through these 3 or 4 different coffees and trying a few different things, getting all the information that he needs in order to succeed with his roast plan. So I guess the next thing that we could do is, open up the discussion a little bit more and look at some of our other competitors outside of the top 4. So we have a few different variances across all the different competitors. So we've looked at our top 4 and seen how some profile packs deviate, different power curves that have been used. I actually noticed in the top from the positions 4 to 10, sorry, 5 to 10, that some competitors actually use filter profiles. Most use cupping, but yeah, there's a couple of filters there. So I guess, yeah, maybe Sean, you could jump in. And why do you think that some people decided for this approach?
I think that it's actually, I think it's quite a great thing to do, just to try and pull some maybe a bit more out of the coffee and just push it a bit further than going for maybe absolute clarity with the cupping profiles. I think it can really highlight some of the other aspects that might not have gotten pulled out during the cupping profiles. Yeah, I think it's very interesting to go straight to that, but it might also be a bit closer to what they might be used to, and it might just be a slightly familiar turn with them, and it might, just give them a bit more sense of familiarity and control over all the variables and everything that they're encountering for the first time.
That makes sense. I mean, the competitor we were just zooming in and looking at there from Australia, Sangchu Li, he's used filter A profile packs for all of his roasts. He's used in all of his roasts, but one, he's used the same power curve and has just done some very slight variations of his DTR. Like we're talking less than a percent on all of them. So, but knowing him, and I think he's come from a background of competing in the Brewers Cup and other competitions, and using a link perhaps at home or at work, he's probably roasting with filter profiles most of the time. So having that familiarity probably in his mind gave him an advantage. And I don't believe that he actually works as a roaster at all. So someone who's coming from a non-roasting background, being able to come to this competition and place 7th in the world is pretty phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah, Mitch is what he's called, and like I've known Mitch for a while, and how he works with the coffee, and obviously from a background of honor days, like working with him, and very methodical approach to his roasting, and anything that he does baristering, I'm sure is taking that same tendency that he's always methodical and very analytical. I think that he's done an approach here, and if I could speculate, is similar with keeping constants. As you said, you've got a limited time frame and you have a smaller amount of I guess decisions that you possibly can make effectively in that time frame, that he's chosen to keep constants where it's a filter profile, a standard power curve, production size in terms of batches, and standard to some extent, apart from the first one where he's obviously noticed that he wants to go up, increase of a fan adjust, and he's actually letting the coffee itself and how they express really dictate the tendencies of the coffee. I think that his strategy was see the natural tendencies of the coffee and then be able to do a roast plan that will suit. Something that I find really interesting in possibly strategizing why he's gone for filter is, as we know, production roast is where the assessment is on taste. One thing to note is overall roast plan style. Yes, you are sample roasting, but if you're looking for a transition onto the production roast, filter roasts have a general tendency as a plan to be a longer profile. I'm going to pull up just an expression that I think would be really nice to show is when we actually have a look at, a base overview of the different profile styles between cupping, omni, filter, and espresso, we see a much longer roast time when it comes to average looking at some of the filter approaches. I think what's really nice in this is it's probably more, I guess, as a perspective of where we would expect to see the production roast hitting, time-wise or at least approach-wise in the parameters. If we have a look more detailed into the plan itself, like it's one of the, slightly, sorry, that's an espresso plan. Let me just correct that. I thought I pulled up filter. But when we have a look at the filter approach, and I'll just transition to that one, apologies on that, is that we see from an A perspective, there is a longer target, I guess, roast time when it comes to the perspective. We have a slightly different cracking area, and we saw a lot of the roast being 7 minutes or around that time frame when it came to the roast, where when we're on filter A, we're looking at more of a 6 minute 40 kind of cracking time. So already he's really stretching out the Maillard phase in comparison to the cupping approach, and then choosing to spend less time in the development phase there. So I think that that's a really great strategy on allowing a more representative roast time that gives you an analytical point of a cupping profile, but in a time frame that maybe feels like it's going to have more of the similar weight, textures, and bodies as what you'd get from that production roast. Jerome, is there anything that you see in that real approach?
Yeah, no, I think he like fell in love with like the filter A approach, and it was something that he was very familiar with. Like as you said, I'm sure that he's had lots of time to be able to utilize the link system, and he found the filter A to best be like that kind of expression that he could push towards on the stronghold, and decided to try all of the coffees basically off of that. I can see towards the end that he decided to make that slight adjustment at the end, which was making that 210. I'm going to presume that that was the one that cracked way outside the window. And if we're looking at that, that's at log 25. You can see it was much outside of the window where he actually wanted to be. So I think he made a quick little adjustment and decided to do that one again so he can properly see that expression of what he was familiar with, so that he could create a roast strategy for him to go into a stronghold versus it limiting his perspective of what that coffee is actually looking like. But for me, I feel like it's a very sound approach. He knows what he's familiar with, and he can figure out the best way to translate off of that. So keeping that same variables the same in terms of using that filter A and that same power curve and same load batch size, and just seeing how the coffee would react is a very sound approach.
Yeah.
Just looking at sorry, just a question in terms of I guess the length of roast. So if we're looking at say Mitch Sungchul Lee from Australia, Ali Reza from Turkey, who placed 8th, and then Stephen from Indonesia, who was 10th. All of their roasts, because they're all using filter profiles, and as you said, Sam, they're like, we have a slightly longer total roast time. Comparing the way in which they roast with filter A and filter C to say Andrea or first place TaiYang as well, each of these roasts in the filter profiles on average is say about 30 seconds longer than the cupping profiles. So if you're doing 5, 6, 7 roasts, you're actually losing a couple of minutes there in your time. Do you think that there's a disadvantage to using, there's an advantage, as we talked about, to using the filter profiles if you're familiar with them? However, is there a disadvantage in losing that additional time? Maybe you're able to do one extra roast if you're going with cupping instead.
I think that on that perspective, it's more about knowing what you're there to target and see and what you're looking for. I think that there's some way disadvantage that you can't get as many batches done, but advantage that you have the ability to see the attributes that you want to see. And as we see, like he still managed, if we still talking on Australia, to get through 5 roasts, 5 filter roasts with a longer roast time. It's definitely the shorter of the longer style filters. But I think that in terms of time frame, it's more about using the attributes that you want to go and see. One thing which I just checked, and I think it's a really cool feature, and I'm actually just going to take us back to a point that Jerome touched on. So I'm going to open up the link app, and I just tested it while we were talking just to make sure it worked. There's all the features that the users could look at in the sample. One of them, which we mentioned, was the advanced dial-in feature, which allows you to check a profile and then see if that profile itself was matching the suggested power curve based on the first crack, and if it was out. And one thing I just did a little test on why he may have went from 207 to 210, and I put it through into the advanced dial-in. And when you have the first cracking point, which is way outside of the expected cracking time, by using the advanced dial-in, it'll resuggest based on the profile pack you're using what's a more appropriate power curve. And when I did it, I was like, maybe this is why. I was just trying to strategize. I was like, maybe it actually suggested 210. So I just put it into the system to check and actually saw that come up. I'm like, that's another aspect of how I can see some of the competitors' thought process of why they changed power curve. May not have been the fact that they just made an instinctive change, but they were using some of the attributes of the application and the, I guess, software that's provided for them to make those quick decisions on stage in that limited amount of time.
Awesome. Well, I think another thing that we've talked about throughout looking at all this, those are, oh, sorry, Jerome, you go ahead.
No, I wasn't saying anything. All good. Continue.
Yeah.
No problem. Sure. As I was saying, there's something that we've noticed throughout the top 4 that we looked at, and now a few other competitors, is there's a recurrent theme of fan adjustments. Nearly all competitors have consistently used fan adjustments, maybe with the exception of Stephen from Indonesia, who placed 10th. We can see that there's some red cells there. So there's actually like is it a negative adjustment to a fan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That would be they've subtracted away from the altitude trim setting.
Right. So I guess maybe Sean, you can jump in first on this. Why would a competitor use a fan adjustment in the first place? And how would it change their roast? If they were changing it from roast to roast, say going up by 0.005, then the next roast putting it up even higher, if they're roasting the coffee in the exact same way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a great tool to use. I use it all the time. It really kind of just helps with oscillation and just making sure that we can get like even heat distribution across the coffee itself. Often enough, we find that if certain coffees are maybe a little bit denser, they come out, they're not getting as much oscillation going through. Sometimes heat can come across a little bit unevenly, can cause our roast to become a little bit more uneven. Yeah, we find that adding a little bit more fan just helps with that evenness, can sometimes maybe help with a bit of clarity coming through in taste. I think it's a great feature to see a lot of the competitors utilizing. And I think it has really kind of helped strengthen a lot of their roasts on these roasters. It's interesting to see some of them subtract, because most of the time, inside and outside of competition, usually we see users go up in fan rather than down in fan. So it's quite interesting to see that maybe they were finding that coffee was drying out a little bit too much, and they were trying to take away from that by taking down the fan a little bit. But maybe not so much that you would start getting an unevenness in the roast. So it's really interesting to see that Emmanuel from Italy really started to play around with that, being the only one to really delve into negative fan adjustments. I think that it's a very interesting thing to do, especially on stage. But good for him to be able to get in so many samples and to be able to test that and just to see what he could pull from it.
Yeah. I think on that point, Sean, for me, the thing about the link system is it's designed to incorporate all styles and species and different screen sizes, and potentially something that he identified is one of the copies provided was a smaller screen size, which would mean in order to make sure that the movement of the coffee, because we know it's that pulsating fluid bed, and it's, fan or air is the driving force, that possibly he noted from the first roast of that one, or a roast, that it was moving a little bit quicker, so that by lowering it, he actually, as you said, got a more stable and even roast. And even talking on that competitor, I think the interesting thing is seeing the competitors start to diverge away from just the top 4 using the D and A profiles, which are the more classic, to some of the competitors starting to play around with the B 15% cupping profile, and then some of the other filter bases. I think it's nice to see in terms of approaches that variation. Also, something that I see is a tendency when we're looking and discussing Turkey and these guys, like some of the power curve suggestions, knowing the application and the algorithm, like these power curve suggestions are not naturally given by the link itself. That competitor has analyzed the profile and decided, I would like to have a higher increment of heat approach throughout this roast, so I'm going to intentionally overpower the profile in order to make all the phases happen a little bit higher, but I'm going to keep high or regular development adjustments on those particular profiles, which I think is super interesting, especially knowing, you know, the approach that these are very hot profiles. You know, this is a very high heat increase, and I'd love to dive deeper into the thought process of what they were looking for by doing as high heat increases at the start of the roast and throughout the roast to make all the phase timing happen a lot quicker. And as we see, some of the highest development percent ranges throughout the entire competition. And then you see other competitors, as you mentioned, like Manuel, and, you know, quite a unique profile. We could pull up and see where he actually does a very high increase amount on that particular profile and very short development. I think that when we were looking at the profiles themselves, it was one of those really, 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 really unique approaches that we were not surprising, because again, I'm sure each competitor has a reason for how they would like to approach a coffee. But it is a very interesting approach comparing to some of the other coffees. And I'm going to pull that one up because I think it's one that a lot of people would be, you know, just keen to see, because you can look at the data, but unless you actually see the profile itself, you know, this is something that to us is like, it's a varied approach on how you would look at it. Working with this competitor in the workshops and that beforehand, and it was very clear that he wanted to use a base, which is, you know, the B base, and make edits to get the style of roast that he's looking for. But we can definitely see a very high increase coming into the end of the roast, and, you know, then a very short development phase afterwards with, you know, a relatively low increase and percent, very short amount of time spent post first crack. So unique
It's very interesting
approaches.
shape, actually, because, you know, I guess most of the profiles we've looked at, for some people who may not have seen them before, they all look quite similar. They have that kind of that very smooth arc that carries through, whereas this one has a bit of a ski jump vibe to it, which is not something that we normally see. But, you know, yeah, I mean, I for one honor the respect the customization and what he's aiming to do there.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was quite surprising to me when I looked at the data and I saw that, you know, this profile in particular, the development percentage is 4.2. And throughout the competition, looking at all the competitors, I think this was the lowest development percentage. And then the highest we had was, I think, at 16.5. So
I think there was 20. There was 20%
Oh,
from
right.
someone in Turkey had a
Yeah.
very high amount of increase. But yeah,
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, with that variance, like we've already looked at batch size variance, and I'd love to touch on that again. But given the, you know, the different percentages, you know, how does the variance in the development percentage correspond to maybe the placement of competitors at the end of the competition? I noticed that the top 4 all have, you know, similar kind of DTR percentages for their copies, even though they're changing between packs and changing their styles. You know, they're not varying more than a few percent. So, I mean, Jerome, did you notice anything between that consistency in DTR in competitors?
Yeah, I think there's definitely that form of consistency. Like the standard rule approach that majority of people would probably be doing is a range between 10 and 12%. And if you're looking at those top 4 competitors, all of them are sitting within that range, because they know that's the tendency that they'll probably have within their stronghold, but within their production style as well, of how it will actually cup versus how a standard person would actually drink, in order to get that elegance and taking the specific areas on the score sheet. I find like Italy's approach, like I kind of understand where he is wanting to go with it, because he wanted to test the limits of how much energy he could actually put into the roast post, like before entering into first crack, just to see how the coffee would respond and testing out the system. Maybe he didn't have enough time to really test out the link to see how much energy he can get away with beforehand. Or I found it to be like quite an interesting approach, because some people really like to put in a little bit of extra airflow or a little bit of an extra gas tank when it comes to entering into first crack. So I feel like that was kind of his approach with it. He was trying to mimic what he could do from a production style. But from a standard style approach, you can see like everyone was wanting to control their airflow and always get that 10 to 12% to try and emulate exactly how they were going to score within the score sheet, but as well something that was very familiar with them, so they could cup with their team and be able to understand how to best have the best roast strategy and roast plan for finals. And you can see that led them to quite a lot of success. And you can see outside of Mateusz from Poland, all of them were logging first cracks to allow them to each have the exact control that they wanted to.
yeah. I think on that point, every 9 of the top 10 used the DTR adjust function, where by logging the first crack, it alters live the profile increase, termination points, and time spent in the roast to make sure that the exacting maybe DTR adjusted point that they were going for was actually targeted, ensuring that, instant termination from that point was able to be achieved. I think another point I find interesting, and I don't know if it's something you're going to touch on, Jordan, is just the competitors. I just looked at that then, is we actually had 4 machines. So not all of these competitors are using the same machine. They're all using 4 individual units we provided. But in the top 10, there's a healthy balance from a competitor of all stations. I do know that Sean, myself, and the team at Kaffelogic spent a lot of time ensuring the machines were operating all efficiency, and exacting within the calibration. Every competitor, every station, we did calibrations roast, but it's just nice to see that there wasn't a particular favoring of one particular machine doing well, and there was this healthy balance of all competitors over all stations represented in the top 10, which at least from us is a really nice thing. It's nice to see that hopefully everyone found that they had a fair and true expression of the machine in their time.
I totally agree. I mean, the last thing that you want is for these competitors to work on any one of the 4 stations provided and say, oh, that one's better, or this one has a problem. So, having those procedures going through, doing calibration, what you and Sean did so meticulously, going through and checking all the machines, making sure everything's operating properly, having those demonstrations and practice roasts on each of them is really, really essential. And yeah, it's beautiful to see that there is that even distribution throughout the top 10 competitors as well. And I mean, I expect we would see the same thing going down through all the way through to, I believe it was 22 competitors. We'd see that even distribution through. So I'm conscious that, I mean, we're all in different time zones, different countries. So I'm conscious of keeping Sean and Jerome up too late. So I did have 1 or 2 more questions. We did touch on batch size quite a few times. So there is a variance throughout all the competitors from 50 grams to 100 grams. In the case of Andrea, who placed 3rd, the Austrian competitor, we talked about how 80 grams was, I mean, Sam, you said that you liked 80 grams as just the actual volume of coffee within the roaster, and you like behaviorally how that works in larger production roasting with that, that ratio of batch size. But we also touched on having a lower batch size, say 50 grams might be advantageous for time management and getting through more roasts. So for someone who wants to go into this competition next year and the years to come, what do you think, what do each of you think would be a good approach? Should it be experimenting with different batch sizes? Should it be deciding on a low one and sticking with it, or doing what Mateusz from Poland did and just ripping out 2 100-gram batches and dropping the mic and walking off stage?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to what data points does that competitor need to make an educated decision on their roast plan and production component. Like, what are you familiar with? We're all, the magical thing about coffee is we all have different ideas, different perspectives, different theories. And my honest opinion is no one's right or wrong. They're just different interpretations. And the thing about this is, depending on your interpretation, your theory, your approach, how does using the myriad of features that you're provided with the link system, which attributes do you need to give you a clear understanding of how to formulate your roast plan moving forward? So I wouldn't say, in my opinion, there's one better starting point. I think if playing around with the expression differences, that the smaller batch sizes are known, even though the roast plan and behavior and timings will be the same, to express more light, more juicy, more open, softer bodied, where the higher batch sizes more full, more sweet, more textured driven in expression. If that's something that you find beneficial to your competition approach or approach in general, then it's an aspect to play around with. If it's something that you're just going for sheer efficiency, and as you saw from the #1 place, wanting to play around with development percentages, fan increases, not so much fan increases, sorry, development percentages and profile styles and profile curve increases, then, keeping it fixed may be great for efficiency so that you can get through a big number of batches. I think it really tailors to the approach of the individual and what they see beneficial, that they have, ample opportunity within the system to find out those information points.
Well, I guess following on from that, maybe Sean, you can answer this. Like, you know, I guess my question to Sam then was, you know, what should a competitor do? What might be advantageous? But, you know, as he said, it's not necessarily about one way is the right way. It's about just doing what you're comfortable with and having, you know, that solid knowledge base behind you and feeling comfortable to make those variations. Looking at other aspects of the roast aside from the batch size, what advice would you give to a competitor moving forward? Maybe Sam, if you can zoom in just slightly more on that as well. Looking at the tendencies across these top 10, if someone comes to you and says, yeah, I want to compete next year or in the following years, using the link as a sample roaster, what advice would you give them in terms of if they have zero knowledge, where should they start?
I think that the best place to start is pretty much where it recommends you to go. You know, that's one of the areas that really makes the link is that it really helps you get as close to a perfect roast as possible. And I think that trusting the system, we can see, you know, kind of gets you to a really good starting point. And then from there, being comfortable to explore with the different profile packs and that to play around, you know, with the different phases. I think it's just really trusting the system. I know that it's not necessarily a system that a lot of people are very used to. It is a different way of thinking in terms of roasting for those that are familiar with more traditional methods of roasting. But yeah, just as a starting point, trusting the link recommendation as your main, you know, launch point, and then going from there and not being afraid to play around too much with some of the other profile packs and different styles. You know, again, looking forward to what you might want to do in production, not just going completely blindly. But, you know, maybe like starting in cupping, moving to filter, really stretching the coffee, pushing the coffee. I think that would kind of be my main point of advice for someone that's wanting to come into it that might not have roasted on link before.
Awesome. And I guess before we finish up, maybe Jerome, if you were to look at all these roasts, I mean, you weren't at the competition. None of us ended up tasting these coffees, you know, throughout the competition. If you looked at this data sheet and you looked at the roasts, which competitor would you like to drink the coffee from the most from these samples?
Yeah, to be honest, there's like multiple that I'd love to see, to be honest. Like the one that I feel like I'd be able to see the widest spectrum on is probably number one. You can see that he isolated specific variables and you can see he did it deliberately and in a controlled environment. I wouldn't mind as well tasting Italy because he did a bunch of different custom approaches, and I'd love to see what he was wanting to achieve and if he did achieve that and how he would make his changes from there. I feel like there's a lot of almost everybody's I'd love to see. And of course, even with the other people with the filter style profiles, I'd love to see what they were trying to get out of it and see how that carried over in terms of the finals. But as well, if I'm looking at someone to really isolate on, I think it is number one. I think he really executed it well. Like Sean was saying before, he really trusted the algorithm and developed his own sense of style that he wanted out of it. And that variable that he constantly changed was that development. He always had everything else blocked and just played with that to see what thresholds he could get away with. And I feel like that really put him in a really comfortable position to move on to their production style because he knew beforehand how far he could push these coffees and what that was going to resemble. That way he was making very educated decisions before even jumping onto the production roaster.
Awesome. Well, yeah, an excellent summary. And yeah, hopefully with the next year's competition, we do have an opportunity to taste some of the coffees and actually see how all these different variations of approaches affect the taste of the coffee. So I guess with that, we'll wrap it up. And yeah, I want to say thank you to the three of you for joining and dialing in from around the world, from France, New Zealand, and Australia. So all of the data that we've been looking at today, so that's the data sheet and then some of the profiles that from the top 4 competitors, we will make available. There'll be a link down in the comments here if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're watching on social media, then head to our website and you can find it there as well. So yeah, thank you to the three of you. And yeah, I guess we'll keep chatting and look forward to next year's competition as well.
Yeah, wonderful. And yeah, thanks, Jordan. Thanks, team, and thanks to the competitors for giving us the opportunity to be able to see the mindset and thought process into how they use the system, but also how they are looking to roast. And we look forward to being at the competition for the next 2 years at least, involved and having the chance to dive into data like this, which is super amazing experience.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And yeah, we'll see you next time.